Welcome back to Awakening Reformation, where Reformation awakens now. My name is Grant, and joined with me tonight is my beautiful wife, Erica, the weaker vessel.
Hello, everyone.
If you would like to find out more about Awakening Reformation Podcast, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at Awaken Reform Pod. You can email us, awakeningreformation@gmail.com. You can also find us on iTunes and any other podcast catcher or app. You can subscribe, rate, and review. We greatly appreciate it. And we also greatly appreciate all the feedback and engagement on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. It's really great to speak with you guys and to engage with you. This week on Facebook, we had a couple new likes, right?
Our new likes on Facebook this week are Deb Hinkle and Andrew Kimberly Jackson.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you, Andrew Kimberly
Jackson. Yes.
For the new Facebook page likes. We appreciate it.
That's right. Share us with your friends.
We have a couple of announcements this week, hon. Would you like to share that with the listenership?
Right. I'm not sure how much of the cat we should let out of the bag. But since the Rebel Alliance Media podcast announced on their podcast last week that we will be working together in the near future, if you don't know who they are, we encourage you to go check them out. They are two guys from Canada, and they're pretty awesome, and they have some really legit stuff that they put out. Wednesdays, they have a podcast. Fridays, they put out some really cool cultural type videos on their Facebook page. So we encourage you guys, go check out Rebel Alliance Media. If you like us, you'll be blown away by them because they are infinitely cooler and smarter than we are.
Precisely. So rebelalliancemedia.com. You can find some resources on there. That's their website.
Yeah. And they do have a Facebook page as well.
Yep. So go like their page and check out P. Nate and Pootie Tang.
Also, for the month of July, we have some merchandise that we need to get rid of before we move.
Dun, 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 dun.
So, in order to save us some space in our U-Haul, we would like to send you guys free stuff.
Who doesn't love free stuff?
That's right. We have some t-shirts. We have a tumbler.
That is gigantic.
It is huge. Of course, it has our logo on it and all that good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
We have some more stickers. We have all kinds of good stuff. All you have to do is go on iTunes or your podcast catcher, Facebook, and leave us a review.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't even have to be a particularly elaborate review. We would just love a review. That helps us, and we just love to hear from you guys. So if you would do that, it will put you into the drawing at the end of the month, make you eligible to win some free merch.
That's what I'm talking about.
So we don't have to move it.
So you know what's funny is you said just review. What if we get someone who leaves like a 1-star review and they win?
I mean, if they leave us a 1-star review, I don't think they want our merchandise.
I don't think so, but they're going to get entered.
We'll send them a Rebel Alliance t-shirt or something.
That's awesome. All right. So tonight's topic is somewhat of a heavier topic, but we thought applicable to everyone, though. Everyone will deal with this themselves or will probably have a loved one or a close friend who will walk through this as well. And what we're talking about is suffering and grief.
Right. Everyone has walked through seasons of despair and just trials, and if you haven't, you will at some point in your life.
Yeah, it's going to happen.
Everyone walks through hard seasons. Maybe you are good friends to someone who is, and you're struggling knowing how to minister to that person through their trial. That can be very difficult too. Mm-hmm. So we're going to talk about the theology of suffering and trials and stuff a little bit tonight. And then at the tail end, we're going to do a little bit of like application, kind of giving you a little bit of
practical
tips and how to walk through it yourself and help someone else walk through it.
Exactly. So we hope this will be edifying, encouraging, and ultimately equipping you to be able to go through it yourself, biblically.
In a God-glorifying way.
Exactly. And to walk with someone else in a God-glorifying way. So,
yep.
And so, from the outset, we do want to say that we're not coming from an ivory tower in all of this. I mean, this is biblical stuff that we've had to apply in our real life and wrestle with too.
We've had children with health issues and surgeries, and we've lost 2 pregnancies. We had an ectopic pregnancy.
Yeah.
That was very traumatic. Probably the hardest thing we've ever walked through.
Yeah,
we were both very young, And so everyone's gone through hardships in their life, and this is coming from two people who had boots on the ground. You know, we understand how hard it can be and how traumatic it can be at times. So we hope you hear us speaking to you as someone who's walked through it ourselves, comforting you with the comfort that's been given to us.
To get started, where should we begin?
I'm sure everyone's heard someone ask the question, why do bad things happen to good people?
Yep.
Or if God is so good, why does he allow suffering?
Usually someone asking that question is asking it from a place of suffering or from a place of grief. And at that moment, their judgment and their view of life and everything may be cloudy, maybe a little foggy.
Right.
It's wise to go into that situation or answer that question at least with some grace and some humility and just gentleness for that person. But the question itself is flawed theologically because there are no good people, right? All humanity is bad, according to Romans 3. None are righteous, no, not one. And the only time a bad thing happened to a good person was when Jesus was crucified.
Right. So you have to go back then to creation, and we can see in the creation narrative that God did not create humankind and the earth to experience trials and suffering. He made things in a way that was at perfect unity and harmony with himself and with each other. And so it wasn't until Adam and Eve acted in rebellion against God and disobeying his commands that sin was introduced into the world. And because of that sin, God did place a curse upon the earth itself, upon the serpent who deceived Adam and Eve themselves. So we are born in Adam under a curse, and the earth is cursed.
And what's incredible about Genesis 3 is God didn't leave us there. So we understand why suffering is here, why death is here. But when God was cursing the serpent, he told him that I will put enmity between you and the woman, and I will put enmity between your seed and her seed. And though you will bruise his heel, he's going to crush your head. He's going to bruise your head and take back dominion and take back authority and actually bring renewal.
Restore it back. Right. So even in the curse itself, we see this glimmer of hope, this promise of a future restoration.
Yeah. Even
in the symbolism of Jesus crushing the head of his enemy, the snake's seed versus the woman's seed, we see that symbolism of Jesus crushing the headship that we're born under. We're born into Adam.
Right.
Adam is our federal head. And so in that symbolism, we see that Jesus is crushing that dominion, that headship, and now born anew into a new family, into the family of God, Christ, and he is now our federal head, if we do in fact belong to him.
Yeah, and this is what Paul picks up on when he calls Jesus the second Adam.
So this shows that, Christ is revoking Satan's headship and is regaining the nations for himself.
Yeah, and Satan tried to offer it to him without going to the cross.
Yep.
In the desert, Satan tempted Jesus and said, I'll give you all these, and showed him all the nations if you just bow down to me and worship me. No cross, no suffering. And Jesus refused. He said, we are only to worship the Lord our God.
Well, Satan tried to offer him the nations without having to have his head crushed, essentially.
Right. Yeah, it's good.
I'll keep headship, but you can have the nations, as if that would even be possible.
Yeah.
Anyway, you might be saying, well, that's all well and good, but how in the world does that offer me any hope in the midst of my struggle and my trial right now? How would you say that story, that promise is in any way, shape, or form good news for the person who is maybe face to face with some of the deepest, darkest despair a person can face in this life?
One of the first things we can see, especially post-resurrection, from the time of Adam to Jesus' life, people were looking forward to this restoration, into this redemption. And now we look back at the work of Jesus and we look at the resurrection and we see that our sin is no longer our master, that we see that it has been defeated. And So you may say, well, it doesn't look defeated. It's right here in front of me. But again, people were depending on the promise of God from the time of Adam to Jesus. And look, God fulfilled it.
Right. Romans 6:14.
God fulfilled his promises. So we can be sure that God is not leaving us here just to suffer, that he will fulfill his promises.
Right. And we can see in Colossians 1:20 that because Christ's work on the cross and his resurrection to new life, that restoration, that reconciliation process is begun. And that is our hope, right? Mm-hmm. That our hope is in, like you said, sin is no longer our master, that now we can be born into a new family, that Christ can be our head, our federal head, and that he is reconciling all things to himself. That's really our hope amidst a trial, is that this is not how things are supposed to be, right? Like if you've been diagnosed with cancer, or maybe you've lost a child or something, some terrible atrocity that's happened to us. Maybe your house was wiped away in a flood, or just there are terrible things that happen. And we can say, well, that your house was washed away by a flood because the earth is under a curse. Mm-hmm. You get cancer because your body is under a curse. And Jesus is actively reconciling both of those things back to himself. That's the promise. We have a hope that will not be our reality forever. Mm-hmm. And so even if that cancer does ultimately take your life, there's hope in life for the next. That cancer might take your life, but there's hope for something beyond just this sin-wearied world.
And it can only take your life temporarily.
Right.
God ultimately holds your life in his hands and will resurrect you on the last day.
Right.
The other thing about suffering and how God works it in his sovereign will, even all the treacherous things that happened to Jesus, we're told in Acts, were done according to the will of God.
Yep.
We see the glory in Christ through his suffering. And we're told this by Paul and Peter, that the Messiah needed to suffer. And it was in order to receive a greater glory. We can see in our own lives that through our suffering, we see God sustaining us. Mm-hmm. Just like Paul asked God to take away his thorn in the flesh 3 times, and God told him, my grace is sufficient for you.
Right.
And we see in Romans 8:28 and 29 that God works all things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose.
Well, that's the key right there. It's according to God's purposes.
Right.
And sometimes we're just never going to know what God's purpose is in the loss of our child or something terrible like that. We can't see it because we're not God. But that's when, like Paul said, in our weakness, where we are unable to see how God could bring anything good out of it, you trust that he's going to be glorified. That in our weakness, he's made strong. He looks great. He looks grand. He looks magnificent. And that's a hope, because even in our sorrows, even in our deepest, darkest grief, God can still be glorified.
And we can even look at the Westminster Catechism. The very first question asks, what is the chief end of man? And the answer is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. Mm-hmm. And that's through everything.
Amidst suffering.
Yeah. It's good and bad times we are to glorify God and enjoy him forever.
And if you look in James, he talks about, count it all joy, my brothers, when you incur trials. And you can say, how in the world can I count it joy when I'm going through a trial? That sounds ridiculous. Are we supposed to be super happy that our child died? Or
psychotic.
Yeah, that just sounds ridiculous. But I think there's a distinction to be made between joy and happiness. Mm-hmm. Being American, sometimes I think that we don't necessarily understand what joy is. We're spoon-fed happiness.
Right.
Do this, you deserve happiness. Take this, it'll make you happy. That's why antidepressants are like the most commonly administered drug in America, because everyone wants to be happy all the time. And there's no concept of not being happy.
Yeah, perpetual just happiness.
Yeah, and so, but joy is something deeper. You can be walking through the deepest sorrow of your life and still have this joy that comes from God. And that joy comes from God being your treasure,
Exactly.
Him being on the throne. He's the most important thing of your life. And no matter what happens to you, he's still sitting on the throne. He's not going anywhere. He's still in control, even though circumstances might feel to our humanly senses out of control. It might seem like everything is just going crazy and you just don't even know what tomorrow might hold for you. But God does. And he